Tidewater has made waves as a consolidator in the offshore vessels sector. In this latest episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, we're in conversation with Quintin, President and CEO of Tidewater. You'll hear from Quintin about the M&A process, future opportunities, and the future of the offshore vessels market in a time of energy transition. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News, and I'd like to welcome Quintin Kneen to the podcast. Welcome, Quintin.
Thank you for having me.
I think just to start off, Quintin, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became CEO of Tidewater?
Absolutely. So I started my career many moons ago as an accountant. I was an accountant in Houston, Texas, which has a large energy industry. As I got to know the energy industry, I got more excited about it, and I ended up leaving public accounting to go into the energy industry. One of my first big stops was a company called Grant Prideco, which did drill pipe manufacturing as well as drill bit manufacturing. And a couple of members of the board on that company, which eventually got sold to National Oil Well Barco, were on the board of a vessel company known as GulfMark. And so I went over to become the CFO of GulfMark Offshore back in 2008. And then in 2013, I became the Chief Executive Officer of GulfMark Offshore. 2018, we merged GulfMark with Tidewater, and I took on the CFO position at Tidewater. And then the following year, in 2019, I took on the CEO position at Tidewater.
Okay, so that brings us up to your current position in Tidewater. And you mentioned there the merger of GulfMark and Tidewater. And consolidation has been very much a feature of Tidewater's strategy in the last few years. Can you just tell our listeners a bit about how the company has been able to successfully execute this strategy?
You know, it's based on a skill set that we've been developing over a long period of time. One of the key elements of acquiring another business is integrating the business well when you do so. And at GulfMark, we were relatively small. So we were about a quarter of the size of Tidewater when we merged, but we were just as spread out. So in order to be effective as a small company with a global presence, we had to be very efficient, and we had to leverage our computer systems to the highest degree possible. So we always focused on efficiency and scalability because we had too few vessels to be as spread out as we were. But when we merged with Tidewater, that was a real advantage. So we were able to take that scalable technological footprint and bring Tidewater onto that system. And it allowed us at Tidewater to become much more successful and much more efficient. In the first year of the acquisition, after we did the Tidewater GulfMark merger, we were able to reduce G&A by approximately $100 million. And so it was a substantial savings that we were able to bring to the combination. And a big part of the integration is also working with people, because invariably a lot of those cost savings are the reduction of headcount. And so in order to get that done effectively, you've got to show people that you can become more efficient, that you can operate effectively with fewer people without unduly burdening the people that remain. So we were very focused on all of the acquisitions, through the Tidewater acquisition of GulfMark, through the Tidewater acquisition of Swire, and the Tidewater acquisition of Solstad, of showing people that we can bring a more scalable, efficient infrastructure to the shore-based staff, and therefore when we make those reductions, it can be done in a way that doesn't burden the employees on the shore any more than it otherwise would. So it's a very important piece of it, is the scalable infrastructure that we're able to build.
I mean, obviously there's some difficult decisions involved in a process like that.
Absolutely. It's always difficult, and I will tell you the most difficult decisions always relate to headcount. You know, that's the hardest part of that process. And you know, I'll be honest with you, in all of those acquisitions, you have to act swiftly. And sometimes when you act swiftly, you make the right decision. Sometimes you make the wrong decisions on people. There are a lot of people that used to work for the combined companies that I'm glad to rehire. but you have to make decisions swiftly in the integration process, because the uncertainty that the integration gives to a shore-based group is overwhelming. So you try to make sure that you can resolve any of those uncertainties, show them that you've got a scalable infrastructure that they can employ and not be overly burdened as a result of the acquisition. And those two things are, I think, just really important.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. Could you just briefly take us through the different acquisitions you've made and what those have brought to Tidewater as it is today?
Absolutely. So when we did the combination of GulfMark and Tidewater back in 2018, it brought to the combined business a strong presence in the North Sea. Tidewater has a strong presence in West Africa, and they had a strong presence in other areas outside of the UK sector in the North Sea, so principally in Norway, but they also had a presence in the US Gulf of Mexico and into Latin America. But what the GulfMark acquisition brought was a set of high quality, large deck vessels, primarily based out of Aberdeen, to the combined fleet. So that was a very important piece of the commercial rationale for the acquisition of GulfMark. Now, the other acquisition was the combination of the systems and just bringing the scalable footprint to the combined entity. The next acquisition was the acquisition of the assets from Swire. And that brought a strong presence here in Singapore, where we're at today, as well as a strong presence in Africa and Australia. And then the acquisition that we did last year of Solstad brought a reinforcement of the position in Norway. So the acquisitions since 2018 have been primarily focused in Europe, Africa, and Asia. My recent focus has been on acquisition opportunities in North America and South America, where we haven't picked up as many assets over the past 5 years.
I think firstly, there's quite a diverse set of geographies in there and the acquisitions you've made so far. What are the challenges of bringing that together culturally?
It's the nice thing about the vessel industry is that it has always been naturally very diverse from a cultural background. Many of the mariners are experienced in other cultures around the world, just as the nature of their job. They're moving from one culture to the other in the transit of their duties. And so as a result, having a mixed culture throughout the world has always been very common. So it's always been common to have Filipino mariners as well as Indian mariners on vessels around the world, Eastern European mariners on board the vessels throughout West Africa and throughout Europe. In the U.S., it's primarily by regulation focused on U.S. mariners, but in Mexico and even Brazil, there's always been a wide acceptance of bringing multinational people onto the vessels, and as a result, it's breeded naturally an openness to diverse cultures, and as a result, the company has always been built on that type of diversity. So we've got very broad cultural diversity. We have very limited gender diversity. Not as many women are attracted to the vessel industry, and that's not uncommon in the shipping industry broadly.
Yeah, it is a very international industry in that sense of diversity, isn't it? The other part that you mentioned there was further potential acquisitions in North and South America, and I was going to ask you if there was still room for further consolidation.
Well, I'll tell you, the industry has improved over the past 5 years, and a consequence of that improvement is that everybody would like to sell their assets for more than they would have 5 years ago, right? And so it makes acquisitions more challenging. Some of the acquisitions that we did earlier were done at a point in the cycle where I wasn't as worried about the price we were paying for the acquisition. Nowadays, I want to make sure that the price that we're paying for vessels is appropriate for the existing value to our shareholders. So because the industry has become more competitive over the past 5 years, prices have gone up, and we just have to make sure that those prices aren't more than we should pay for assets of that quality. And there's still opportunities out there today, but the negotiations are just much tougher.
And then, you're looking more at you said North and South America.
Yes. Well, more there just because the recent acquisitions that we've done, GulfMark, Swire, and Solstad, didn't have as many assets in those locations. And as a result, proportionally, we're probably underrepresented in the Americas as a global company, and I'm looking for ways to reinforce that position.
You're saying it's got more difficult in terms of pricing because you came in at the earlier acquisitions at a time when the market had been in a lengthy downturn. Yeah.
Yes, and it was an interesting time because at that time, people weren't as convinced that the industry was ever going to recover. And that's very natural when you go through a long down cycle. And so there were a lot of questions as to whether or not the industry would continue on and resurge as it has. I always believed that it would. I wasn't sure exactly when, but I'm pleased that it's come to fruition in that way. But yes, because things have gotten better, people aren't as desperate. And when they're not as desperate, they hold out for better pricing. And sometimes what they're holding out for isn't quite justified by the current market conditions.
Okay. The art of negotiation then.
Yes, right, exactly right.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. With that improving market, has it got to a point where it's a good time to actually order new vessels?
Not yet. The funny thing is, as good as I feel about the market today, it's still not good enough to order new vessels. So my hope is that we're going to continue to see improvement in the market, and eventually, if everything plays out the way that most people hope, we'll get to a point where ordering a new vessel is justified. But even as good as the market is today, it's still not good enough to order a new vessel. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If we go back to the period in like 2010 to 2014, which was the last really big new build cycle for this industry, the idea of the energy transition, it was there, but it wasn't prevalent and it wasn't top of mind. And it wasn't to the point where it was questioning the viability of the industry longer term. And nowadays, people are definitely convinced that the industry is strong and has a has a bright outlook today. But they are concerned about how long it's going to last. They don't know when the hydrocarbon era, or even if the hydrocarbon era, is going to roll over. Some people want to say it's 2030 or 2035. Nobody knows just yet. But when you're making an investment in a new vessel, that's a 20 to 25 year investment. And if I were to order today, I probably couldn't get a boat until 2028 at the earliest. And that means I got to be thinking about a time in 2045 or 2050, and what is the industry going to look like at that time? And nobody's quite sure. The other thing that is keeping people from ordering today is they're not really sure what is the right propulsion system for a vessel. I don't think anybody wants to be in the industry in 2040 and be using a diesel-based energy. So as a result, people are waiting for whatever engine technology is going to be the next improvement in our industry. And because people aren't really sure about the duration of the industry from the standpoint of how it's going to be affected by the energy transition, and because they're not really sure what engines to put in a new vessel, it's making everybody pause, and it's delaying anybody's ideas on new construction today. And then to me, the most critical thing is, do day rates support it? And currently the answer is no. Day rates don't even support it. So there's an economic barrier today that people in historical cycles have probably been willing to overcome because they've been very robust in their outlook in the past. Now that outlook isn't as robust, and there's some questions about it, and there's this looming technological obsolescence that nobody wants to get in front of. They want to wait and see what's going to happen with that engine technology, and those things are just holding people back. And so as a result, I think that it'll be just a little bit longer before there's new build ordering in the industry.
On that part of the technology part, and you've obviously got customers who are looking to
Yes.
reduce their emissions and
Yes.
through their operations with you. If you don't buy new vessels, how do you cope with that part?
It's there's a couple of things that you can do today, and honestly, the best thing that we can do today to help manage emissions of the global industry are to focus on what we refer to as voyage management. So in the past, anytime somebody would charter a vessel, we would go at whatever speed they told us to go at to go visit the platforms or offshore rigs or offshore wind farms. But there's a growing awareness of the fact that the voyage management is an important element in reducing carbon emissions. So if you're out there and you're not going at full steam, you're able to save a significant amount of fuel. Historically, oil and gas companies haven't been worried about saving fuel because it's their fuel and they're naturally long the fuel. And so now that the growing awareness of carbon emissions has come into the forefront, people are now rethinking, well, maybe I don't need to go that fast when I'm going out to a rig. And so voyage management is an important piece of that. The other element, and we see this in automobile transportation too, but one of the most effective elements today, based on the technology that we have today, is hybrid technology. So there are different areas of the world that are on different time frames as it relates to the energy transition. One of the most advanced areas is Northern Europe, principally Norway. And you see them adopting battery hybrid technology much earlier than the rest of the world. It's rudimentary in the grand scheme of things because it's not a solution and it doesn't bring a zero carbon footprint to the vessel, but it's able to save upwards of 20% of emissions by going into a hybrid model. So it's what we can do today is voyage management and hybrid technology. In addition, along with hybrid technology, I would say that being able to plug in at the shore base to the existing continental grid is an important way to keep the emissions down and also keep noise down in various locations around the world. But even things as simple as shore power connections, you don't find those in West Africa. You find them in some areas, but certainly not throughout West Africa. So the world is progressing at different speeds on the energy transition. And what I see is Northern Europe driving that, principally Norway. And the technologies that I think are available to us today that can make a real difference are voyage management and hybrid technologies. And then we're going to see the next generation of engine technologies deliver another amount of substantial savings. Again, in Norway, they're looking at ammonia technologies, they're looking at hydrogen technologies, and other near zero emissions that aren't in place today, but I think could be in place in 10 to 15 years.
Okay, so that's a picture of what you're doing today, and then some of those technologies that are essentially there in the future.
Yes.
Now, you talked about the oil and gas market and the uncertainty of how long things will last. How do you position yourself as a company with the ongoing energy transition and the business?
Yeah, it's actually very exciting. There's two things that are happening. There's the desire of the world to move away from hydrocarbons. And so that brings into question the long-term demand curve for offshore vessel activities. But offsetting that is an increasing interest in offshore wind. And that's well established in Northern Europe for the same reasons that I was indicating before, that they're more focused on carbon reduction technologies, but it's growing in certain areas around the world. And I think we're going to see that to continue to develop as we go through the remainder of 2020s and into the 2030s. And then on top of that, people are becoming more focused on what we casually refer to as plug and abandonment, which is removing existing offshore hydrocarbon-oriented assets from the ocean and bringing them back to scrap yards and having them dismantled. And further to that, there's a very nascent but emerging business in carbon sequestration. So all of those things require vessels. So there's a demand shift from the hydrocarbon-oriented activities to the renewable activities that we will see over time. I don't think it's going to happen as fast as the world would like it to happen, but it's definitely happening today. And I think we're going to continue to see that for the next 5 and 10 years.
Is that something you can do with your existing fleet, for example, carbon capture and storage and offshore wind, or do you need to do conversions? How would this work?
A little of both. There are certain things that are very common in any offshore activity. And for example, in offshore wind, where you put the wind farm stems and where you run the cables, it's not that much different than where you would drill for hydrocarbons and where you would put the pipelines. So those technologies that are required to be applied to evaluating the seafloor, so you know where you're going to put your cables and you know where you're going to put your wind farm stems, is not that different from of how you're establishing an offshore hydrocarbon field. So in the very start of the evaluation of a wind farm, it's very similar to the start in a hydrocarbon field. And as a result, those vessels are the same. But after you get into the construction phase, it becomes different. And you need larger vessels in order to lift the equipment and the wind farm stems and place those into production. And cable laying vessels and the support associated with the wind farm activities are much different than they are on the hydrocarbon side. So the vessel intensity varies between the two, but they all require a certain category of vessels. The vessels that we have are good for that initial phase where they're very similar to the hydrocarbon-oriented activities. When it gets into field management, then it takes more of an accommodation vessel, which is something that we have in the offshore hydrocarbon side of the business, but it's different because the workers are different. One of the funniest things that you see is, these industries are similar in so many ways, but they're different in some critical ways. And the offshore oil and gas workers, they're not as concerned about the accommodations on the vessels or the daily life on the vessels. They want to make sure that they're getting fed well, and they want to make sure that they've got communications. What we see on the renewable side is they're more focused on making sure that they've got nice accommodations on the vessels and a little bit more recreation on the vessels. Those, as a result, require a different vessel, and sometimes they require new construction. So a vessel that we refer to as SOV, so it's a vessel that you would use in the wind farm. Those vessels are built to a higher standard than what we see in the typical hydrocarbon vessel. So you can convert a hydrocarbon vessel to that type of work, but anytime you have a built for purpose vessel, it usually hits the mark with both the workers on the vessels and with the charterer a little bit harder, and as a result are the preferred vessel. So I would suggest to you that as the world migrates more towards offshore wind activity, there will be a different vessel that gets developed over time.
Okay, so it's going to be dependent on how that progresses.
Yes. Yeah.
Will this change the areas where you operate? Given there are new energy sources and these, will it change the geographies?
It will. And the geographies are changing now anyway. Because what you see in Northern Europe and to some degrees in the United States is a de-emphasis on hydrocarbons and an emphasis on renewables. So you're already starting to see that switch happening. But because there's still a strong demand for hydrocarbons, you're seeing hydrocarbons pick up in other areas of the world that typically we haven't seen. So, over the past 5 to 7 years, you've seen a strong increase in what you would call that northeast corner of South America. So Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad, but Brazil broadly. So South America in particular is really regaining strength, and it slumped a little bit in 2012 and 2013. And so that's really picked up. And then where in South America the activity is occurring is different. So that's evolving. On the other side of the Atlantic, in West Africa, you're starting to see it move up into northern West Africa and then south into Namibia and other areas. So, in Equatorial Guinea and Senegal, and down in Namibia, more activity levels. So it's the the transition, even in its initial phases, are causing changes in the emphasis on where hydrocarbons are focused, as well as picking up activity on the renewable side.
Okay, and that sort of speaks to what you said earlier about where you're looking at acquisitions as well, geographically.
Exactly.
Okay, I'd just like to sort of round this up now, and perhaps you could tell our listeners where you see Tidewater in 5 years' time.
I'm going to say 5 to 10 years, if you will, because I'm not sure how fast this transition that we're all talking about is going to happen. I'm excited about it. But what I would suggest to everyone is that Tidewater will still be a company focused on offshore floating assets for the energy industry. It's going to move. It's going to move from drilling intensity into offshore wind, and it's going to move from general production support to support related to plug and abandonment and support related to carbon sequestration and other renewable activities. So it's going to be an exciting time. I don't know the pace of it. I don't know if it's 5 years or 10 years or maybe even 15 years. And I don't think we're going to know for another 5 years. But the core competencies that I want to continue to develop at Tidewater is, efficient ship management of the offshore energy industry. And it's going to move from more hydrocarbon focused activities that we've had over the past 60 years into more of our renewables focused over time.
Okay, great. I look forward to coming back and talking to you in the future to see where you are going on this voyage.
Well, thank you. I look forward to updating you at that time.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.